At 4:47 a.m. on March 14, 1943, Corporal Teodoro Teo Villanueva crouched in a waterlogged foxhole on the northeastern ridge of Mount Banahaw, watching 17 Imperial Japanese Army infantrymen advance in tactical formation through the fog-draped kogon grass exactly 73 meters downslope. His right hand gripped not a rifle, not a grenade, but 3 leather pouches connected by braided abaca rope, a bola he'd constructed from scavenged water buffalo hide and fishing weights. The nearest American artillery support sat 14 kilometers west, across enemy-controlled territory, unreachable by radio, since their transmitter had shorted out in yesterday's monsoon downpour. In approximately 90 seconds, the Japanese point man would crest the terraced rice paddy below and spot the guerrilla position, triggering a firefight the undermanned Filipino resistance fighters could not win with conventional tactics. But Teodoro Villanueva had learned something in these mountains that no military academy had taught him: that the jungle itself could become a weapon if you understood its rhythms, and that sometimes the most devastating tools were the ones your enemy never saw coming. The mist clung to the volcanic slopes like wet cotton, muffling sounds, distorting distances. From his position, Teo could hear the methodical crunch of Japanese boots moving through the undergrowth. Steady, confident, textbook infantry advancement. These weren't green conscripts. These were veterans of the Bataan campaign, soldiers who'd pushed American and Filipino forces into one of the war's greatest defeats just 11 months prior. They moved with the precision of men who'd won, who expected to keep winning. Behind Teo, pressed into similar foxholes carved from the red clay and volcanic rock, 7 other guerrillas waited with a motley collection of weapons: 2 Springfield rifles with less than 20 rounds between them, 3 captured Arasaka rifles with no ammunition at all, 4 bolos, and Sergeant Ramos's rusted M1911 pistol that misfired 1 shot in 3. They were farmers, fishermen, a former schoolteacher, a carpenter. The Philippine Commonwealth Army had dissolved months ago. What remained was will, jungle craft, and improvisation. And Teo's ridiculous bola. Still planning to herd cattle with that thing? Private Domingo had whispered 3 hours earlier during their pre-dawn movement into position. The joke had become standard, repeated so often it had lost its edge. Corporal Villanueva, the buffalo herder from Sariaya, who brought a ranching tool to war. The man who wouldn't shut up about rotational momentum and entanglement, coefficients like he'd discovered some lost tactical principle, instead of just refusing to let go of his farm boy roots. Even Sergeant Ramos, who'd commanded a regular Army rifle company before the surrender, had been skeptical. "Teo, I respect your creativity," he'd said 2 weeks ago when Villanueva first demonstrated the weapon at their hidden camp in the foothills. "But this is jungle warfare, not the provincial rodeo championships. The Japanese have machine guns, mortars, artillery. You have weighted rope." But Teo had seen something the others hadn't. He'd watched, night after night on patrol, how the Japanese squads moved through the forest. They were disciplined, yes, but they were also creatures of doctrine, trained for open terrain warfare in Manchuria and China, now adapting to Philippine jungles with mixed results. They traveled in tight formations to maintain visual contact through dense vegetation. They relied on superior firepower to suppress and overwhelm. They expected resistance fighters to either ambush with whatever guns they could scavenge or to melt into the civilian population. They didn't expect physics. Teodoro Villanueva was 26 years old, born and raised in the coconut plantations and grazing lands east of Mount Banahaw. Before the war, he'd worked his uncle's Carabao Ranch, managing a herd of 37 water buffalo across 300 hectares of grassland and rice paddies. His formal education had ended at 6th grade when his father died and the family needed his labor. He'd never fired a rifle until December 1941. He'd certainly never imagined himself a soldier. The Commonwealth Army had conscripted him in early 1942 during the desperate recruitment drives following the Japanese invasion. They'd given him a uniform that didn't fit, 3 days of rifle instruction, and assigned him to a provisional engineering battalion tasked with destroying bridges in the path of the Japanese advance. That unit had disintegrated during the chaotic retreat into Bataan. Teo had made his way back to Quezon Province on foot, traveling by night, avoiding Japanese patrols, living off the land. By the time he linked up with Sergeant Ramos's guerrilla band in June 1942, organized military resistance in Luzon had largely collapsed. What remained were scattered cells of fighters, some former soldiers, many more just civilians who refused to accept occupation. They had almost no ammunition, no supply lines, no coordination with Allied forces. What they had was intimate knowledge of the terrain and a determination to make the Japanese pay for every mile of territory. But knowledge and determination didn't kill enemy soldiers or slow their movements. For that, you needed weapons, and weapons were the scarcest resource in the resistance arsenal. Teo had adapted to guerrilla life quickly. His hunting skills, his ability to navigate by stars and terrain features, his understanding of weather patterns. But in firefights, he was a liability. He was a poor shot with the rifles they occasionally captured. He had no military training in tactics or fieldcraft beyond what Sergeant Ramos could teach in between operations. The other fighters, many of them former soldiers or constabulary officers, treated him with polite condescension. He was useful for carrying supplies, for scouting, for his knowledge of the back trails and villages. But in a fight, he'd be better off staying out of the way. The mockery started after the disastrous ambush at the Tai Bas Highway checkpoint in September. The resistance cell had spent 3 weeks planning the operation, hit a Japanese supply convoy, steal weapons and ammunition, disappear into the mountains before reinforcements arrived. 7 fighters, good positions, the element of surprise. It should have worked. It failed because the convoy had been reinforced with a Type 97 Chi-Ha tank that their intelligence hadn't detected. The guerrillas' small arms fire had pinged harmlessly off the armor plating. The tank's machine gun had torn their positions apart. 3 fighters wounded, 1 captured, executed the next day, and 0 weapons seized. The cell had barely escaped. During the after-action discussion at camp, Sergeant Ramos had gone around the circle asking each fighter what they'd learned, what could be improved. When he'd reached Teo, the corporal had said something that, in retrospect, everyone remembered as the beginning of the Bola obsession. The tank couldn't rotate its turret fast if the treads were immobilized, Teo had observed. In the grazing lands, when bulls charged the fence lines, we'd use bolas to tangle their legs. The momentum works against them. 3 kilos of weight spinning at velocity can snap a bull's radius bone. Tank treads have similar vulnerable rotation points. The silence that followed had been profound. "Corporal," Sergeant Ramos had finally said, his voice carefully neutral, "are you suggesting we lasso Japanese armor?" "Entangle," Teo had corrected. "Bullets don't lasso. They wrap around the target using rotational energy transfer." if the weighted ends strike the mechanical linkage between tread segments. Teo, Private Laxon had interrupted, barely suppressing laughter. I love you like a brother, but you've been breathing too much jungle air. We're fighting the Imperial Japanese Army, not competing at the fiesta. The meeting had moved on. But Teo hadn't. The problem, as Corporal Villanueva understood it, wasn't that his idea was stupid. The problem was that it didn't fit into anyone's framework for what weapons were supposed to be in modern warfare. Warfare, in 1942, was about firepower, about rifles that could kill at 500 meters, about machine guns that could sweep a hillside in seconds, about artillery that could obliterate fortifications from kilometers away. The whole technological evolution of military conflict since the Industrial Revolution had been toward increasing the distance and volume of lethal force projection. And here was Teo talking about weighted ropes. To the former Philippine Army soldiers in the resistance, it seemed like a regression, going backward from guns to primitive hunting tools. To the civilians turned fighters, it seemed impractical. Why waste time on something unproven when ammunition was the bottleneck for every operation they planned? But Teo couldn't let it go, because he'd seen something they hadn't during his years managing the carabao herd. Physics doesn't care about modernity. A water buffalo bull weighs 600 kilograms and can charge at 30 kilometers per hour. When Teo needed to stop a charging bull from trampling fences or injuring other animals, he didn't try to match its mass or speed. He used a Bola, 3 leather pouches, each filled with 700 grams of lead fishing weights, connected by braided abaca rope, exactly 2.4 meters in total span. He'd spin it overhead until the centrifugal force made the rope sing, then release at the optimal angle. The weighted pouches would wrap around the bull's front legs in a fraction of a second. The animal's own momentum would pull the rope tight. The sudden constraint would cause the bull to stumble, often falling completely. No bullets required. No strength contest. Just applied physics and precise timing. Teo had dropped charging bulls 37 times over 4 years with that technique. His success rate was over 90%. So, when he watched Japanese patrols moving through the jungle in their tight tactical formations, maintaining 2 to 3 meters between soldiers, advancing through areas where firing lanes were limited by dense vegetation, he saw the same physics problem as a charging bull herd. Mass plus velocity plus sudden constraint equals fallen target. The difference was a fallen Japanese soldier in a firefight could create cascade effects: broken formation, confusion, momentary exposure of other squad members, psychological shock. In close quarters jungle fighting, where engagements happened at 20 to 50 meters instead of 200 to 500 meters, seconds of disruption could shift the entire tactical situation. But explaining this to people whose entire conception of combat centered on firearms was like explaining color to someone who'd never seen. For 3 months, while the guerrilla cell conducted reconnaissance patrols and small harassment operations, Teodoro Villanueva spent his spare time developing and refining his Bola weapon system. He started with materials. Traditional Filipino bolas used woven rattan or hemp rope with stone or hardwood weights, but Teo needed something that could withstand high rotational speeds and the violent deceleration of impact without breaking. He experimented with different cordage: hemp fiber, abaca rope, salvaged parachute line from a crashed American aircraft, even braided wire from telephone cables. A Bola proved optimal. The rope, made from manila hemp, had excellent tensile strength, some elasticity to absorb shock loads, and enough texture to prevent slippage. He braided 3-ply Bola cord to a thickness of 8 millimeters, then treated it with rendered pig fat to resist moisture degradation. For weights, he tried rocks, lead, brass fittings, steel bearings, salvaged from destroyed vehicles. The ideal weight, he determined through testing on tree trunks and bamboo poles, was between 600 to 800 grams per pouch. Enough mass to maintain rotational momentum and deliver disabling impact, but not so heavy that it became difficult to spin or required excessive strength. He settled on lead fishing weights sewn into pouches cut from water buffalo leather. The leather was durable, the lead provided dense mass, and the combination could be shaped for optimal aerodynamics. The geometry was critical. Too short, and the Bola wouldn't have enough wrapping radius to entangle effectively. Too long, and it became difficult to control during the throw. Teo tested configurations from 1.5 meters to 3.5 meters. The optimal length was 2.6 meters from end to end, long enough to wrap twice around human legs or a single wrap around a torso, short enough to maintain rotational stability during flight. He practiced every day, sometimes for hours. He'd find a clearing away from camp, set up bamboo poles at various distances, and throw. He developed muscle memory for the spin rate, the release point, the trajectory compensation for different ranges. He learned to factor in wind, foliage, interference, target movement speed. His accuracy at 15 meters was approximately 80% against a stationary target. At 20 meters, it dropped to about 60%. Beyond 25 meters, it became too unreliable, which meant this weapon only worked in close quarters engagements where the enemy was already dangerously close. Exactly the situations where the guerrillas had the worst odds of survival with their limited firearms. But when Teo demonstrated his improved design for Sergeant Ramos, the reaction was still skeptical. "I see you've gotten good at hitting trees," Ramos had said, watching Teo knock down a bamboo pole from 18 meters with a throw that wrapped the Bola around its base in a perfect spiral. But trees don't shoot back. Trees don't move unpredictably. And trees don't have 15 friends with rifles. Which is why I need to test it against moving targets in realistic conditions, Teo had replied. Absolutely not. We can't afford to waste personnel on experiments that might get someone killed. Then let me use it alone. Next patrol, we run into a Japanese scout. Let me engage first. If it fails, I'll drop back, and you proceed with standard tactics. Ramos had stared at him for a long moment. You're serious. I've never been more serious about anything. The sergeant had sighed, looking away at the jungle canopy. Teo, I admire your dedication. But this guerrilla band isn't equipped for innovation. We're equipped for survival. We hit when we have advantage. We fade when we don't. We preserve our strength for when it matters. Your weapon is. It's interesting, but it's not reliable enough to risk lives on. And that had been the end of the official discussion. But Teodoro Villanueva hadn't needed official permission to keep preparing. By March 1940, the tactical situation in Quezon province had become increasingly desperate for the resistance. The Japanese had consolidated their occupation throughout Luzon. Their patrols had become more systematic, more aggressive. They'd established a network of garrison outposts throughout the lowlands, pushing guerrilla bands deeper into the mountains. Supply drops from Allied submarines had become sporadic and unreliable. The ammunition situation had reached critical levels. Sergeant Ramos's cell had exactly 43 rifle rounds remaining. 43 rounds to sustain operations, defend positions, and conduct the ambushes that were their only source of replenishment. It was a death spiral. They couldn't get ammunition without attacking the Japanese, but they couldn't attack without ammunition. And every engagement that failed to capture supplies pushed them closer to irrelevance. The Japanese, meanwhile, had adapted to guerrilla tactics. They traveled in larger patrols, minimum 12 soldiers, often 16 or more. They varied their routes and timing. They'd started bringing Filipino collaborators who knew the terrain and could identify likely ambush sites. They'd established a brutal reputation for reprisal. For every Japanese soldier killed, they'd execute 10 civilians from the nearest village. The guerrillas were being squeezed into strategic irrelevance. Too weak to seriously threaten Japanese operations. Too isolated to coordinate with other resistance cells. Too low on supplies to do more than survive. It was in this context that the intelligence about the Mount Banahaw patrol route arrived. A sympathetic villager brought word to the guerrilla camp. Japanese soldiers had been using a specific trail system on the northeastern slopes of Mount Banahaw for weekly patrols to a radio observation post they'd established near the summit. The patrols were predictable. Every Wednesday, departing at 0330, 17 soldiers, moderate security protocol because the route had never been attacked. Sergeant Ramos saw opportunity. The trails in that area were narrow, hemmed in by dense vegetation and steep grades. The guerrillas could set up an L-shaped ambush at one of the switchback turns, achieve maximum surprise, focus overwhelming fire on the point element, and withdraw before Japanese reinforcements could arrive. But the ammunition problem remained. 43 rounds against 17 enemy soldiers. Even with perfect fire discipline, perfect accuracy, perfect tactical execution, the mathematics were grim. "We can't take this fight with guns alone," Private Laxon had said during the planning session. "Not with our ammunition situation." "Then we supplement with blades," Ramos had replied. "We hit with gunfire, then close with bolos before they can organize a defense. Closing with Japanese infantry is suicide," another fighter had pointed out. "These aren't poorly trained conscripts. They have bayonets, they have grenades, and they've been training for close combat since before most of us knew what a rifle was." The discussion had gone in circles. Every approach led back to the same problem. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and out of options. That's when Teodoro Villanueva had spoken up. "I can disable the point man and the second soldier without gunfire. That's 2 targets removed from the fight before the first shot. Then when we open fire, the Japanese are already disrupted, already confused about what's happening. They're trained to react to gunfire. They're not trained to react to something they've never encountered." The silence had been heavy. "Corporal," Sergeant Ramos had said carefully, "are we really having this conversation again? You said we can't take this fight with guns alone. I'm offering a solution that conserves ammunition and creates tactical surprise. The terrain is perfect. The switchback puts targets at 15 to 20 meters, which is my effective range. The vegetation provides concealment for approach. I've been practicing this specific scenario. You've been practicing throwing ropes at bamboo poles? Weighted entanglement systems at moving targets in jungle terrain," Teo had corrected. "And yes, every day for 3 months." Private Domingo had laughed, but it had been a nervous laugh. Even if, and this is a huge if, even if your vaquero trick works on the first soldier, you have one bola. You throw it, and then what? You're unarmed in the middle of a firefight. Teo had pulled back his poncho to reveal 3 more bolas coiled at his belt. I carry 4. I can throw all 4 in under 12 seconds. That's potentially 4 disabled enemies before conventional weapons even engage. The skepticism in the room had been palpable, but Sergeant Ramos had been studying Teo's face. You genuinely believe this will work? I know it will work. The physics are sound. The materials are proven. I've run the calculations. I've done the practice. I've anticipated the variables. This isn't hope. This is applied science. Ramos had looked around at the other fighters, reading their doubt, their desperation. Then he'd turned back to Teo. If you miss, if this fails, we're committed to a fight with ammunition we can't afford to waste, and we'll have lost the element of surprise that was our only real advantage. People will die because of that. I understand. Do you? Because I don't think you do. This isn't about your pride or proving your idea works. This is about 8 men walking into a fight against 17 Japanese soldiers on a mountainside where there's no retreat route. If your technique fails, we don't get a second chance. Teo had met his commander's eyes steadily. Then it won't fail. And somehow, impossibly, Sergeant Ramos had nodded. All right, you get your chance, but you follow my rules. You take the first throw only. If it works, if the enemy is genuinely disrupted, then you can proceed. If it fails, you drop back immediately, and we fight conventionally. Understood? Understood. That conversation had been 3 days ago. Now they were in position, and the Japanese patrol was 73 meters away and closing. The guerrillas had moved into their ambush positions at RO2 3 hours before the expected patrol. They'd used the darkness and fog for concealment, moving in single file along a game trail that paralleled the main path. Each fighter carried their assigned weapons wrapped in cloth to prevent metallic sounds. They'd rubbed their skin and clothing with mud to eliminate scent and reduce visibility. Sergeant Ramos had positioned them in a modified L ambush formation along a section of trail where a sharp switchback created a natural kill zone. The main force, 6 fighters with the functioning rifles and Private Laxon with his bolo, occupied positions on the high ground overlooking the trail's upper section. They'd have elevation advantage and could cover the entire kill zone. Teodoro Villanueva occupied a forward position in a varhol 30 meters ahead of the main ambush line, positioned at the outer edge of the switchback where the trail narrowed to less than 2 meters wide. His role was to engage the point element from close range before the main ambush triggered. It was a position of both honor and isolation. If Teo succeeded, he'd create chaos in the enemy formation at the crucial moment. If he failed, or if the Japanese detected him before he could throw, he'd be overrun with no support and no fallback position. Private Domingo had gripped his shoulder before they'd moved into position. Brother, if this doesn't work, don't try to be a hero. Just run. We'll cover you. Teo had nodded, but hadn't replied. They both knew there would be no running from this position if things went wrong. Now, in his foxhole, Teo performed his final preparations. He'd excavated the position 2 days prior during a reconnaissance patrol. A rectangular hole, 2 meters long, 1 meter wide, half a meter deep. Just large enough to crouch in, deep enough to be below the sightline of someone on the trail. He'd placed cut bamboo over the top and covered it with leaves and soil for camouflage. From more than 10 meters away, it was invisible. He'd left a narrow observation slot facing the trail, just wide enough to see without being seen. His 4 bolas lay arranged on a flat stone beside him. He had been inspected. The rope checked for frays. The weight pouches tested for secure stitching. The first bola was already in his right hand, 2 of the weight pouches gripped together, the third hanging free for the initial spin. He'd selected this particular bola for the first throw, slightly lighter than the others, at 650 grams per pouch, which gave it better flight characteristics at the 15 to 20 meter range he anticipated for the point man. The second and third bolas were heavier, 750 grams, for closer range throws if the patrol bunched up after the initial contact. The fourth was his emergency reserve. Through his observation slot, Teo watched the foggy jungle and controlled his breathing. 4 seconds in, hold for 4 seconds out. The meditation technique his uncle had taught him for calming nervous bulls. It worked equally well on nervous soldiers. He could hear the Japanese patrol now, not just the footsteps, but the small sounds of equipment, canteen water sloshing, rifle slings creaking, the soft clink of ammunition pouches. They were maintaining noise discipline, but not silence. Professional soldiers, but confident ones. They'd run this patrol route a dozen times without incident. They expected no trouble. Teo could see movement through the fog now. Dark shapes materializing from the gray morning murk. The point man emerged first, a corporal by the rank insignia visible on his collar. Type 38 rifle held at port arms, eyes scanning the trail ahead, but not the flanks. The vegetation was too dense to worry about lateral threats. Behind him, spaced at 3-meter intervals, the rest of the patrol. 17 soldiers in a column formation, textbook Japanese infantry tactics for restricted terrain. The second man was watching the trail sides. The third was watching the rear, a rotating cycle of security awareness. They were 60 meters out. 55 to 50. Teo released his breathing meditation and shifted to combat focus. His mind became purely tactical. Range estimation, wind assessment, target movement prediction, timing calculation. The point man would pass within 15 meters of Teo's position. That was the optimal throw range. Close enough for accuracy, far enough that the bola would have time to rotate through 2 full spins before impact, building maximum momentum. 45 meters, 40, 35. Teo slowly shifted his weight, bringing his right foot forward into throwing stance. The movement was glacial, calculated to avoid any disturbance in the camouflage above him. His hand began the first rotation of the bola, keeping it low, keeping it silent. The weighted pouches responded to the circular motion, spreading into their orbital positions. He could feel the familiar pull of centrifugal force, the rope singing with tension. 30 meters. 25. The point man was now at the exact position Teo had marked with a small stone during his reconnaissance. The second soldier was moving into the zone. In approximately 7 seconds, the spacing would be perfect. Teo increased the rotation speed. The bola whistled softly through the air, a sound lost beneath the ambient jungle noise and the footsteps of approaching soldiers. 20 meters. Through his observation slot, Teo had perfect visibility. The point man was focused on the trail ahead, looking for obstacles, not threats. The second soldier was glancing left at the dense undergrowth. The third soldier was 15 meters back, outside of Teo's immediate concern. 15 meters. Teo rose smoothly from his V-hole, the camouflage sliding off his shoulders. The motion was fluid, rehearsed 1,000 times. His right arm came up and over in a throwing motion, identical to the one he'd used on charging bulls, the one he'd practiced until it was as natural as breathing. The bola released at the optimal angle, approximately 35 degrees above horizontal, aimed not at where the point man was, but where he would be in the 0.8 seconds it would take the weapon to cross the distance. The three weighted pouches separated into their triangular flight configuration, connected by the taut rope spinning through the air in a flat plane that hummed with rotational energy. The Japanese point man had just registered movement in his peripheral vision. His head was beginning to turn. His rifle was starting to come up. He was at least a second too slow. And the law struck him in mid-torso level on the weighted pouches wrapping around his chest and left arm with violent speed. The rope constricted instantly, binding his arm against his body. The lead weights delivering impacts that Teo heard even from 15 meters away. Sharp cracks as they struck ribs and shoulder. The soldier's forward momentum combined with the sudden constraint created exactly the physics Teo had predicted. The man pitched forward, unable to use his trapped arm to catch himself, his rifle clattering to the trail. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs in a whooshing gasp that carried clearly through the morning fog. The entire sequence, from Teo's rise to the soldier's fall, had taken less than 2 seconds. The second Japanese soldier froze, his brain trying to process what his eyes had just witnessed. His training hadn't prepared him for this. Gunfire, grenades, even close combat with blades, all of that fit into his tactical framework. But a soldier collapsing from what appeared to be rope? That 1 second pause cost him. Teo already had the second bola spinning. This throw was at closer range, 12 meters, and the target was stationary. The bola crossed the distance in half a second and wrapped around the soldier's legs at knee height. The man collapsed sideways with a startled yell, his rifle discharging into the air as his finger involuntarily clenched on the trigger. That gunshot was the signal Sergeant Ramos had been waiting for. The jungle erupted with gunfire from the guerrilla positions above. The ambush unfolded with brutal efficiency, but not in the way any of the fighters had expected. The Japanese patrol, instead of responding with their drilled counter-ambush procedures, was locked in a moment of complete confusion. The first 2 soldiers were down from a threat they didn't understand. The gunfire was coming from an unexpected direction. And standing 15 meters in front of them, clearly visible in the breaking dawn, was a Filipino soldier spinning what appeared to be weighted rope over his head. It violated every tactical expectation. The third Japanese soldier in line tried to bring his rifle to bear on Teo, but he was blocked by the second soldier, thrashing on the ground, still entangled in the bola. He stepped right to get a clear shot. Teo's third throw caught him in mid-step, the bola wrapping around his rifle and right arm, jerking both violently to the side. The weapon discharged, the bullet passing harmlessly into the jungle canopy. 3 polders down in 5 seconds, none of them dead, but all removed from the fight, blocking the trail, creating chaos in the Japanese formation. The guerrillas' rifle fire from the high ground was finding targets. Private Laxon, the best marksman, dropped the 4th soldier with a headshot. Sergeant Ramos wounded the 5th with a shot to the shoulder. The concentrated fire was devastating precisely because the Japanese couldn't establish a firing line. Their front elements were tangled in Teo's weapons, their formation compressed on the narrow trail, their tactical response delayed by sheer confusion. The Japanese sergeant positioned in the middle of the patrol column, began shouting orders. His soldiers were trained. Disciplined, they began to recover from the shock, moving to establish a defensive perimeter, despite the bodies and entangled men blocking the trail. But they were making a crucial mistake. They were treating Teodoro Villanueva as a minor threat, a distraction from the real danger of the riflemen above. The sergeant was directing his men to suppress the high ground positions, to advance past the entangled soldiers, to execute their counter-ambush doctrine. He didn't understand that Teo was the primary threat. The corporal had moved forward during the chaos, closing to within 8 meters of the Japanese formation. At this range, he couldn't miss. His fourth bola wrapped around the legs of a soldier trying to move up the trail, sending him crashing into a tree trunk with bone-breaking force. The Japanese sergeant finally understood. He turned his rifle toward Teo, his face showing recognition of the tactical problem. This Filipino wasn't just disrupting the formation. He was systematically removing soldiers from the fight without using ammunition, creating obstacles, preventing maneuver. The sergeant's rifle came up. Teo had no more bolas. What he did have was a freshly loaded Arisaka rifle lying on the trail 3 meters away, dropped by the first soldier he'd disabled. He dove for it, hit the ground in a roll, came up with the rifle in his hands. He'd never been a good shot with rifles, but at this range, less than 10 meters, even a poor marksman couldn't miss. He fired 3 times. The first shot missed. The second caught the sergeant in the thigh. The third hit him in the chest. The Japanese patrol was collapsing. 7 of their 17 soldiers were down. 3 dead from guerrilla gunfire, 4 disabled by Teo's bolas, the sergeant mortally wounded. The remaining soldiers were scattered, pinned by fire from the high ground, unable to organize because their command structure was shattered and their formation was broken. Some tried to return fire up the slope, but they couldn't see the guerrilla positions. Others attempted to retreat down the trail, but found themselves blocked by their own fallen comrades. 2 soldiers broke and ran into the jungle, abandoning their weapons. The fight lasted another 90 seconds before the surviving Japanese soldiers raised their hands in surrender. When the shooting stopped, 8 Japanese soldiers were dead or dying. 5 were wounded but alive. 4 had escaped into the jungle. 0 guerrillas had been hit. Sergeant Ramos emerged from his position, his rifle still trained on the surrendering soldiers, his face showing profound shock. "Teo," he called out, his voice rough. "Are you hit?" "No, Sergeant." "What the hell did I just watch?" Teodoro Villanueva stood on the trail, surrounded by fallen enemy soldiers. Some shot, some entangled in his bolas, all removed from the fight in a combat engagement that had violated every conventional assumption about modern warfare. "Applied physics," he said simply. The guerrillas worked quickly to secure the battlefield. They bound the prisoners, collected the dropped weapons, 14 Type 38 rifles, 400 rounds of ammunition, 3 grenades, rations, medical supplies, maps. It was the most successful operation the cell had conducted in 8 months. But the material gains were secondary to the tactical revelation. Private Laxon kept walking back and forth along the trail, staring at the fallen Japanese soldiers, particularly the ones still tangled in Teo's blouse. "I saw it," he kept muttering. "I was watching it happen, and I still don't believe it." Private Domingo was examining one of the bolas, turning it over in his hands like it was some kind of alien artifact. "It's just rope, and leather, and lead," he said. wonder in his voice. "How is this different from what we knew you were making?" "It's not," Teo replied, working to untangle one of his weapons from a wounded soldier's rifle. "The materials haven't changed. What changed is that you saw it work." Sergeant Ramos was questioning one of the Japanese prisoners through their Filipino interpreter, trying to understand the enemy's reaction during the ambush. The soldier, a private, kept using words like black magic and demon rope. He insisted that the weapons had appeared from nowhere, that they'd moved impossibly fast, that resistance was useless against such sorcery. Ramos caught Teo's eye and shook his head in disbelief. "They think you're using supernatural weapons." "Good," Teo said. "Fear is a tactical advantage." The guerrillas spent another 20 minutes on the battlefield, then began their withdrawal. They moved quickly, knowing that the Japanese garrison in the valley would notice the patrol's failure to report and would send reinforcements to investigate. By then, the resistance fighters needed to be gone, dissolved back into the jungle like morning mist. They reached their camp by noon, exhausted but triumphant. The other guerrillas, who'd remained behind as camp security gathered around to hear the story. And when Sergeant Ramos described what had happened, when he explained how Teo had disabled 4 enemy soldiers with weighted rope before the shooting even started, the reaction was instant demand for demonstration. Teo spent the afternoon ching. Within 2 weeks, every guerrilla in Sergeant Ramos's cell carried at least one bola. Within a month, Teo's design had spread to 3 other resistance cells operating in Quezon Province. Within 3 months, Japanese intelligence reports from the region were documenting encounters with Filipino fighters using unconventional entanglement weapons that disrupted patrol formations and created disproportionate casualties. The psychological effect was as significant as the tactical one. Japanese soldiers operating in the Mount Banahaw region developed genuine fear of jungle patrols. They knew they faced an enemy who could strike without gunfire, who could disable untold before they could even identify the threat, who could turn the jungle itself into a weapon. Patrol sizes increased from 17 soldiers to 25. Movement protocols became more cautious, more time-consuming. Patrols that had once covered specific routes in 3 hours now required 5 or 6. The Japanese were being forced to commit more resources, move more slowly, and suffer greater attrition, all because of a weapons system that cost almost nothing to produce and required no ammunition. The Bola never replaced firearms in guerrilla arsenals. It couldn't. Rifles remained the primary weapon for most combat situations, but the Bola solved a specific tactical problem: how to fight effectively when ammunition was critically scarce, how to create surprise against an enemy that had adapted to conventional ambush tactics, how to multiply force through ingenuity rather than through firepower. Teodoro Villanueva became something of a legend in the Philippine resistance. Other fighters sought him out for training. Officers from different guerrilla cells sent representatives to learn the technique. The Americans, when they finally reestablished contact with resistance forces in late 1943, included requests for detailed descriptions of the rope weapon system in their intelligence debriefs. Teo was promoted to sergeant, then lieutenant. He led his own cell by mid-1944, specializing in close ambush tactics that maximized the effectiveness of Bola weapons. His unit had the highest operational success rate and lowest casualty rate of any guerrilla force in Quezon Province. But he never stopped being the buffalo herder from Sariaya. He still spent his rest periods improving the Bola design, experimenting with different weights and rope configurations, developing throwing techniques for different tactical scenarios. He trained every new resistance fighter personally, patiently teaching the physics, the timing, the muscle memory required for effective deployment. After the liberation of the Philippines in 1940, Teo was offered a commission in the regular Philippine Army. He declined. He returned to his uncle's ranch, to the Carabao and the coconut plantations, to the peaceful application of the skills that had made him a warrior. But he kept his bolas. And once a month, he'd go to the clearing near his village and practice, spinning the weighted ropes overhead until they hummed, releasing them at imaginary targets, maintaining the precision that had saved so many lives. The official Philippine military records from World War II contain numerous references to unconventional weapons and tactics employed by resistance forces. Buried in those records, in reports filed by American intelligence officers and Philippine Commonwealth Army officers, are descriptions of Corporal, later Lieutenant, Teodoro Villanueva and his Bola weapon system. One report, filed by a U.S. Army colonel in November 1944, states, "Indigenous forces in the Quezon Province region have demonstrated remarkable tactical innovation in the deployment of traditional hunting implements adapted for military use. Entanglement weapons, colloquially termed bolas, have proven effective in close-quarters ambush scenarios, particularly in conditions where ammunition scarcity necessitates non-conventional approaches. Recommend documentation and potential incorporation into special operations training curricula." That recommendation was never formally implemented. The war ended, modern militaries moved on to new technologies, and the tactical innovations of desperate guerrilla fighters in the Philippine jungles were filed away as historical curiosities rather than serious contributions to military science. But in the villages around Mount Banahaw, in the communities where resistance fighters returned after liberation, the stories persisted. The story of Teo Villanueva, the buffalo herder who brought a rancher's tool to war and proved that ingenuity could triumph over doctrine. The story of the man who was mocked until the moment his impossible weapon changed everything. Older villagers who remember the war years will tell you about the time when Japanese patrols feared to enter the jungle, when 17 enemy soldiers fell to 8 guerrillas armed with almost no ammunition. They'll describe how Teo could spin a bola so fast it became invisible, how he could drop a soldier at 20 meters as easily as he'd once dropped charging bulls. Some of the details have grown with the telling. The distances have lengthened. The enemy numbers have increased. The tactical situations have become more dramatic. That's the nature of legend. But the core truth remains unchanged. On March 14, 1943, on a foggy mountainside in Quezon Province, a 26-year-old corporal with a homemade weapon proved something that military academies still struggle to teach: that warfare is ultimately about problem solving, that the best weapon is the one that works, and that sometimes the most effective tactical innovation comes from the most unlikely source. Teodoro Villanueva died in 1987 at age 70, surrounded by family on the same ranch where he'd learned to use a bola as a boy. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his war service in a single line. It said nothing about weighted ropes or tactical innovations or the 15 confirmed Japanese soldiers he'd personally disabled without firing a shot. But at his funeral, 17 former guerrilla fighters attended, some traveling from other provinces, all wearing small bola pins on their lapels. They didn't give speeches. They didn't tell war stories. They just stood in silent tribute to the man who taught them that creativity was a weapon, that physics didn't care about military rank, and that the most devastating tools were often the ones your enemy never saw coming. In the cemetery, one of those fighters placed a carefully crafted bola on Teo's coffin before it was lowered into the ground. 3 leather pouches connected by braided up rope, the weights precisely calibrated, the craftsmanship perfect. A weapon and a tribute. A tool and a legacy. And on the leather, burned into the material with careful precision, 7 words. They laughed. The jungle remembered. He endured. No one ever doubted him again. Not the comrades who fought beside him, not the enemies who faced him, not the officers who dismissed his ideas before seeing them in action. His technique was simple, just applied physics, careful observation, and the willingness to see past conventional wisdom to the truth that effectiveness matters more than tradition. But his legend endures. In the Philippine military museums, among the displays of rifles and medals and battle flags, there's a small exhibit about unconventional weapons of World War II. And if you look carefully, in one corner, you'll find a bola, behind glass, 3 leather pouches, braided rope, lead weights. The placard beneath it reads, Entanglement Weapon, Quezon Province Resistance Forces, 1943-1940. Designed by Lieutenant Teodoro Villanueva. Effective range, 15 to 20 meters. Psychological impact, immeasurable. Tourists walk past without noticing. It's just rope, after all. Just leather and lead. But to those who know the story, who understand what that simple weapon represented in the hands of desperate fighters on fog-shrouded mountainsides, it's something more. It's proof that ingenuity is the ultimate force multiplier. That observation matters more than credentials. That courage isn't about following doctrine. It's about having the conviction to trust what you've learned, even when everyone around you insists it's impossible. Teodoro Villanueva, the buffalo herder who became a warrior. The corporal who changed tactical thinking in his theater of war. The man who brought physics to gunfights and won. They laughed at his homemade bola until the jungle took control. And then suddenly, nobody was laughing anymore.